With Edna, we're talking straight. Straight talk. I can hear you talking. Talking straight. Did I hear you say straight talk? With Edna, we're talking straight. I can hear you talking. Talking straight. Did I hear you say straight talk? With Edna. I can hear you talking. Let's talk. Good morning, and let's talk Straight Talk Live. I'm your host, Edna Howell-Parrish, and welcome to this edition of the show. It is truly a pleasure to be here with you today, everyone coming in, joining us. We thank you for being with us. If you like the show, be sure to check like. And then if you want someone else to know about the goodness that we share, be sure to share the show with them as well. Thank you again. Good morning and welcome for those checking in this morning. The regulars are here. We want some new ones too. So if you're checking in, don't be shy about greetings. Don't be shy about checking in. Don't be shy about saying that you like the show this morning as we join in with our guests. Today is the day that we discuss the issue of African Americans and the issue of African American philosophers and philosophy with our guest from Michigan State University, Dr. John McClendon. The last time John was on, we asked him, we said, well, Dr. John, would you join us every quarter for an hour of power? And John said he'd be glad to do that. So today we're going to be talking about his new book. It's been out for a little while, but we're going to be discussing it. We haven't had a chance to really thoroughly jump into the book and talk about it on the air. So, African American philosophers and philosophy. As I've been reading and studying more about philosophy, a lot of people have been saying, as I read in history, that they didn't even really know African Americans were philosophers. Dr. John took care of all that with his book, and then that he wrote along with his co-partner Dr. Stephen Ferguson. And we'd like to welcome Dr. John to the show this morning. Good morning, Dr. John.
Good morning. How are you this morning?
I'm doing great. John had some difficulties getting the video portion of the show up, but we have him on audio this morning, and we thank you for joining us loud and clear and loud and proud from Lansing, Michigan. I understand.
That's
How's,
right.
how's it going?
Doing well. We have snow here today, so we have to bear with it. But it's always a very warm thing to come on your show.
Right. Thank you. I know when I lived in was it East Michigan, when I lived in Holland, Michigan. I mean, it wasn't nothing to get that lake effect and the snow and 12 inches, no problem. So you same for you, John?
That's right. That's right.
Well, John, why is philosophy so important to us? And as our listeners are listening in this morning, they're saying, well, why are we talking about philosophy on Straight Talk Live? Does it all connect in a manner?
Yes, philosophy has importance because philosophy gives us an opportunity to critically think about our basic assumptions and presumptions that we have as we deal with life from day to day. And so it's not just an academic undertaking for a few people who find themselves as professional philosophers, but it has a real role in the day to day life of everyday people. And many times we operate off of what is traditional and conventional, and we never question our basic presumptions and assumptions. So, philosophy requires us to think about our starting points, where we begin from, how we see the world, how we establish the values that guide us in life, how we come to understand what is good and bad in terms of ethical and moral conduct, what is beautiful and what is ugly in terms of art and aesthetics. And so it becomes a very important way in which we can ground ourselves and think critically about ourselves and the world.
You being a philosopher yourself, why did you think it was important to write the book? There are plenty of books out there written about philosophy and philosophers, but why do you think it was important to write the African American philosophers and philosophy?
Yes, well, I used to say before our book came out that the only thing black in the textbook that we had was the ink. And the students would get a chuckle out of that. And then I would go on to say how the marginalization of African Americans in the field of philosophy was a reflection of a broader question, namely how people of African descent have faced historically a racist and white supremacist world in which then the intellectual capacity of Black people have always been under question. And so you would not find in most textbooks an example of those who were of African descent, and particularly African Americans, involved in any of the readings or discussions about philosophy. So, our book is the first book to introduce the discipline of philosophy by way of the works of African American philosophers. And in this way, not only do we introduce philosophy, but we bring a certain respect and value to people understanding the importance of African American philosophers and, of course, other scholars and in other fields of work.
A lot of people are familiar with the Plato and Aristotle, and these were the great thinkers that shaped the world of the past. And what effect do they have on the world today? Is that why we don't know it or we didn't know a lot about African American philosophers because of what was shaped in the
Oh,
past?
precisely. In fact, one of the things that we bring attention to is the fact that philosophy as a area of discussion and deliberation was the first field to develop what we know then today as theoretical knowledge. The idea of theoretical knowledge emerges when in historical development you have a separation between those who are focused on doing purely mental labor and those who are engaged in manual labor. And what we know historically is that that distinction between those who work by way of hand and those who work by way of mind has to develop over the course of the emergence of civilization. So, in that respect, then, the Egyptians who preceded Greek, who preceded Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and the other, what they call pre Socratic philosophers, were engaged in doing philosophy in ancient Egypt or Kemet. And so the separation of mental and manual labor led to a group of people generally referred to as scribes. And these are people who wrote things down, who taught the complex ideas that were engaged in philosophy. And that philosophy became the springboard for the development of the sciences. At one time, philosophy within the scope of philosophy included mathematics. So geometry and philosophy were one and the same. And when we look closely, we understand that geometry was first developed in Egypt. And so the Egyptians understood the significance of geometry. And then later, as the Greeks employed geometry, we find that the man who is considered to be the first Western philosopher by the name of Thales was also engaged in doing geometry. And then later, of course, mathematics and science develops as a specialized sciences and they emerge separate from philosophy. But initially, philosophy was that domain that we find the very basic things that we concern ourselves with when we think about mathematics, the natural and physical sciences. And in all of those areas, African people were engaged in prior to the emergence of Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. And so it's important that we understand that as a point of understanding world philosophy and how then Africa and African Americans are part of that history.
We're going to talk more about your book, but I have a couple of basic questions I want to ask. And also, welcome this morning, TC. Good morning to you, Brenda Early. Good morning, Jerome Anderson checking in, Joyce Keith. Hey, Joycey. Anthony Prosser is with us today. Good morning, he says family. And Janice Robertson is here. Brandy Waddell is joining us this morning. And if you have questions that you could ask, you want to ask, you can ask them on the line, or you can give us a call at 513-873-7134, 513-873-7134. And Holly is joining us this morning as well. So, John, I want to talk a little bit more about ancient Egypt and Africa. How did how did the philosophy of the ancient Egyptians, the Africans, how did it not get lost during the enslavement period? Who was the keeper
Yeah,
of the
well,
culture?
what over the course of several um, dynasties in Egypt, which takes us into not just hundreds of years, but thousands of years, the development of science and the development of philosophy, which I said before were one and the same in the ancient period, emerged to such a degree that when the early Greeks began to develop their ideas, they had a particular respect for what had preceded them by way of the Egyptians. And so we can find references, for example, from Plato, who makes reference to the fact that the Egyptians were, in fact, the forerunners to the development of philosophy. And he was quite impressed with the Egyptians and what they had accomplished to such an extent that one of Plato's foremost books, The Republic, where he lays out what government and what a state, that is, a political state, should look like, is based upon his understanding of the Egyptian political structure. And so when we think about the dynastic structures that emerged in Egypt, Plato saw those as very ideal for what should be the kind of ways in which people would govern themselves. So this impact was something that the ancients understood in terms of Western philosophy. But however, with the rise of imperialism and in slavery, this was covered up because the argument became that African people did not have the same intellectual capacity as Europeans. So as a result, some of the foremost philosophers of the modern period, such as David Hume, who was Scottish, Immanuel Kant, who was German, and George Frederick Hegel, who was also German. They all argued that African people were intellectually inferior. And so, as a result, much of that earlier history had been um, covered over, and the respect for what the Egyptians had accomplished had been left behind.
Professor John H. McClendon III from Michigan State University, a professor in the philosophy department, uh, is our guest today. And we're talking about his book, The African American Philosopher and Philosophy, An Introduction to the History, Concepts, and Contemporary Issues. More contemporary, what made you decide to become a philosopher yourself, Dr. John?
Uh, that, that's a very that's a very good question. Um, my interest in philosophy grew out of the fact that I found as an activist a very important need to think as critically as possible. And so, in my search for understanding and having a deeper understanding of the world and trying to change the world, I found philosophy to be invaluable. And in my search, I discovered a book written by the first president of Ghana, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. And this book was entitled Consciousism. And after I read Consciousism, I knew right away that that would be very important for me to understand philosophy in a very serious way. And so, long before I got my doctorate in philosophy, I was engaged in both studying and teaching philosophy, both in community classes and also on the campus of Central State University, where I would have classes on consciousism. And very recently, I ran into an old classmate from Central State who reminded me that he had attended those study sessions that I had on Nkrumah's consciousism. What's important, and what Nkrumah points out in this book, he says, practice without thought is blind. Thought without practice is empty. So we have to have a notion of the theoretical basis that will guide our practice, and our practice will then be enriched by having philosophical understanding. So that's what got me on the road to philosophy. It was my activism which compelled me to think seriously about studying philosophy as an instrument for struggle.
You're at Michigan State University, professor of philosophy. How long have you been at Michigan State?
I beg your pardon?
I said, how long have you been at Michigan State?
Oh, I've been at Michigan State now. I believe it's been 14 years, 14 or 15 years now.
And how accepting are the students there of you and your teaching?
Um, I would say that the African American students are very enthused, and I should say African American and students of African descent, because I get students both from the continent of Africa as well as the Caribbean in my classes. And in fact, this semester I have a young lady in my class who is from the Congo, and I introduced to the class the concept of how Swahili as a language has certain philosophical conceptions which are not attached to English. And the discussion centered on the fact that in Swahili, you don't have the notion of a noun as you would in English, where a noun is said to be any person, place, or thing. In Swahili, things are separate from people. So, in terms of grammar, in grammar, you have a category for things called the Kiti class, and then you have a category for people called the Watu WATU class. And so I was pointing out then, from a standpoint of the Swahili language, then people can never be reduced to things. And of course, when we think about slavery, chattel slavery is precisely the reduction of people into things. And so my student from the Congo, who I didn't know she was from the Congo, came up after class and said how excited she was that I brought Swahili into the discussion of philosophy and that she was a Swahili speaker. And she said she's hoped that we'd have more chances to talk about those kinds of connections. So, for many of the students of African descent, whether from the continent, the Caribbean, or the United States, they're quite enthused and happy to know that philosophy is not a white only enterprise. Also, for many of the young white students, they're being introduced for the first time to the topic of philosophy and to the idea that African Americans are philosophers. And so for some of them, it's a eye-opening experience, and it gives them an opportunity to see the world beyond the narrow training that they had received up to this point. Not to mention that for many of them, I am the first Black professor they've ever had. So I think overall, it's been a positive experience.
Excellent. I want to talk about some of the say modern day philosophers in African American history. How did you go about researching and finding out about all the philosophers that are available? This is a tremendous book, I would
Sure,
say. Tremendous.
sure. In fact, one of the things we emphasize, excuse me, in terms of the book are three important concepts: discovery, recovery, and reconstruction. And so that first stage of discovery is a very important stage. Before I got involved in studying philosophy, I had the fortune of having many conversations with my late father about his experiences as a student at Wilberforce University. And this goes back to childhood, where he would share stories about his student days at Wilberforce University in the early 50s. And in that discussion, he would talk about the president of Wilberforce University, Dr. Charles Leander Hill. And Dr. Hill was born in Urbana, Ohio. He went to Wittenberg University in Springfield, Ohio, and then earned his doctorate in philosophy, becoming only the second Black person to earn a doctorate in philosophy from the Ohio State University. And he would tell me a lot of stories about Dr. Hill. In fact, my dad, in many ways, looked very similar to Dr. Hill. And he told me about Dr. Hill, and that generated an interest in knowing more about this African American man who was a philosopher. So it really goes back to my childhood and being introduced by my father to this very important man, Charles Leander Hill. And so I spent a number of weeks and months actually at the archives at Wilberforce University going through the Charles Leander Hill papers. And at that time, the archivist at Wilberforce, Miss Jacqueline Brown, who knew that archives like the back of her hand, she's now retired. But in my book, you will see that I acknowledge Mrs. Brown for all of her work because she took me through the Hill papers and I got to know Dr. Hill in a very profound way. That research also took me to interviewing family members of Dr. Hill, former students of Dr. Hill, as well as colleagues of Dr. Hill. Dr. Hill unfortunately died in 1956 at the age of 50, but he was a tremendous scholar. And that research that I did in trying to recover and reconstruct Dr. Hill's work opened the door for me to know that there were others like Dr. Hill who've been left out of the history books, left out of the discussion of philosophy. And so that was, if you want to say where was the starting point, it started from my childhood and the stories that my father used to share with me about Dr. Hill. And because many of the students that Dr. Hill had were classmates and friends of my father, I took the opportunity to interview those people. And that was a very rich experience, including interviewing Dr. Hill's sister, who, when I published my article in 2003 on Dr. Hill, preceding the book, was gracious to let me interview her. And she even gave me a picture of Dr. Hill.
And I would say, speaking of pictures, your book is beautifully illustrated. A lot of pictures of people gives us an opportunity to put faces and names together. Let's talk about some of the important people in philosophy in African Americans and how we include them in our ability to work together in America today, if at all. If we can't,
Yes,
has it been able to help us?
I think so. I think that what we see, when we begin to understand how profoundly African American philosophers have come to be a critical voice that has often challenged both the philosophical establishment as well as the political and economic ruling class in this society. Um, there is a very important piece written by Dr. Brodus Butler that was written in the Negro Digest, which was a publication of Johnson Publishing Company, who also published Ebony and Jet. And Dr. Butler in 1962 wrote a very important piece about the role of Black philosophers. He himself earned a PhD in philosophy from the University of Michigan. And at the time in which he earned his degree, which was in the early 1950s, he, after completing his doctorate and was out looking for a job, his advisor wrote a colleague, which is typical in terms of trying to get employment in the field, to let this colleague know that he had an outstanding student that was on the job market. And when he wrote this letter to this colleague, he mentioned it to the colleague that Butler was also, and I quote, a Negro. And the colleague wrote back and says, well, don't send me any letters about him. Let him go and teach among his own kind. And that was in the early 50s. What's significant is that Dr. Butler, in writing this piece in 1962, points out how a number of African American philosophers challenged the philosophical establishment. And one person in mind that he uh, cites is Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, some may not know because most people think of Dr. King purely as an activist, but Dr. King, his PhD from Boston University in systematic theology, but he also studied widely in philosophy. And he got his background in philosophy during his undergraduate days at Morehouse College. And one of his professors at Morehouse College was Professor Samuel Williams. And Professor Williams was the longtime chair of the philosophy department at Morehouse. And it was from this training under Samuel Williams that Dr. King got a lot of his foundation in understanding the history of philosophy. Years later, after completing his doctorate, King returned to Morehouse and actually co taught a course with Professor Williams at Morehouse College. And one of the students in that class was the late Julian Bond, who some may know was a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, as well as serving on the executive board of the NAACP for a number of years until he recently died. And so philosophy is intricately tied to, and African American philosophers are intricately tied to the social movement for change. And so we introduce these ideas to our students because Samuel Williams is not known by many people. Neither is Dr. George Kelsey, who was also at Morehouse and a very important mentor to Dr. King. So many of the people who became activists in the 50s and 60s, in fact, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, were influenced by philosophers. For example, James Farmer, who founded the Congress of Racial Equality,
Mm-hmm.
CORE, his father, James Farmer Sr., was a philosopher who had studied and got his degree at Boston University and later became the president of Wiley College, which is a historically black university. Well, James Farmer Sr., the father of the founder of CORE, played a very influential role in educating his son in the field of philosophy. And if you haven't seen the movie on the Great Debate, where Wiley College is discussed in this movie in their debate against a white institution, what would be important to understand is that the president of Wiley College was James Farmer Sr., the philosopher, and the young boy, if you've seen the movie, who was the youngest person on the debating team, was James Farmer Jr. And so many people who watched that movie were not aware of the fact that James Farmer Sr. was a philosopher, one of the first Black people to get a degree, a PhD from Boston University, and who wrote extensively on philosophical as well as theological matters. What was remarkable about the senior farmer was the fact that when he earned his admission to Boston University, he lived in Florida, but he didn't have money to travel, so he virtually walked from Florida to Boston, Massachusetts to pursue his doctorate at Boston University. And
Wow.
so James Farmer Sr. is one of many of those outstanding people that my students in taking this course and reading this book have an opportunity to learn about.
Dr. John Anthony says so. Martin Luther King's connection to Gandhi came from his own studies of philosophy.
Yes, in fact, what many people do not know is the fact that people like Samuel Williams and George Kelsey were already engaged in studying Gandhi. As well, there was a very important person by the name of William Stewart Nelson at Harvard University, who also had been in contact with Gandhi, and he sent works that he wrote about Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence to Dr. King and held workshops for the leadership of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the organization founded by Dr. King. And in Dr. King's letters, he writes to Dr. Nelson thanking him for what he thought was the most thorough piece that he had read to date on the philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi. Additionally, he also had the opportunity to meet with and discuss with the first Black person to meet with Gandhi. And this was a very important experience for him. And Howard Thurman, who later served as the Dean of Chapel at Boston University, was also a Morehouse alum, and he was the first person to actually meet with Mahatma Gandhi back in the 1930s. So there's a long tradition among a number of people who not only understood Gandhi's philosophy, but actually worked with Gandhi. William Stewart Nelson actually joined Gandhi in demonstrations in Calcutta, in India, and knew him very well. William Stewart Nelson started what became then the Mahatma Gandhi Lecture Series at Howard University, and one of the people invited to speak was Dr. Martin Luther King.
Let me ask you this from a more practical standpoint for people listening this morning and trying to understand, you know, I would say people would say the lofty ideas of philosophy and philosophers and even African Americans. The situation that we're in America today, this racial issue that we've been going on and on and on and on with critical race theory. What can philosophers do, or are they working trying to help iron out the problem, or will it always be the same up and down that we have to go through, learning our history, not learning our history, cutting out some of the history? What can philosophers do to help in that area?
Sure. And that's a very good question. We talk about it in the book, and we talk about it from the standpoint of how philosophy became important in the aftermath of the destruction of Reconstruction. Many people who study the history of African Americans in this country know that there was a period of approximately 10 years called Reconstruction following slavery. And that period of Reconstruction was the first time where Black people had a chance to be involved in governmental affairs as elected public officials at all levels, including the United States Congress, local and state government, and the like. But that was overthrown through acts of terrorism. And so 9/11, the people talk about when they said terrorism first came to the United States and the 9/11, that's not true. Terrorism was very much a part of the United States from its very beginning. And
Mm-hmm.
in the overthrow of Reconstruction, there were many who were concerned with trying to develop a strategy for progress. And so we talk about developing a philosophy of progress. And so there are a number of African American philosophers who began to project how it was that Black people in the fight against racism would offer the opportunity of progress from the stage that they found themselves in the period in post Reconstruction United States. One of those people, and he was the first person hired to teach as a Black professor at the University of South Carolina, was Richard T. Greener. Richard T. Greener was the first Black graduate of Harvard University. And that in itself was a remarkable accomplishment. But then he went on to teach philosophy at the University of South Carolina, which in the 1950s and 60s was segregated. But because Reconstruction opened the door for Black students to come to the University of South Carolina, there was white flight. So many of the white students left. And in turn, when Greener came there, he began to teach a core of young Black men and women in at the University of South Carolina. In the meantime, he published a very important work which spoke to the struggle of Black people, and it was entitled The White Problem. And why this work was so important is because much of the attention about which way forward, how should Black people proceed, was shaped by a viewpoint that said that the problem was Black people themselves, and that if Black people would learn to get themselves in order, that is to say, improve culturally, uh, resist certain kinds of values and the like, because the reason why Black people were at the bottom of the social ladder was precisely because there was something wrong with Black people. What Greener offered, and I think it was a very important insight that helped many people who were fighting, was to say the problem was not black people, the problem was white supremacy, the problem was white racism, and what had to take place was then the challenge of the white problem. And so this piece that he wrote, I think, was a very important piece that opened the door to looking at the problem, not in terms of what was wrong with black people, but what was wrong with white supremacy and white racism. So in this way, philosophy has a practical application. It allows us to look critically at a situation. Often I hear people say, we know what the problem is. Well, I sometimes question people who say, we know what the problem is. No, it is precisely understanding what the problem is the first step. And some people do not understand that. I remember, Edna, and I won't say the name of the teacher, but when we were at Dunbar, I remember there was this one teacher, and when students would begin to be unruly in class, he would remark by saying, we're just not ready. We're just not ready. Meaning that black people were not ready to be on the same equal plane with white people. And of course, what adolescents do at that age, what we were doing as young people at Dunbar was no different than what white students were doing at other institutions. But the fact that this black person who had taught for many years and taught black students saw this as a question of a problem with black people is very instructive, because the struggle against racism is what is the key. And many black philosophers has helped us to understand how we have to move forward, or what Dr. King says, where do we go from here? Chaos or community?
Our guest this morning is Dr. John H. McClendon III, professor of professor in the Department of Philosophy at Michigan State University. He's our quarterly guest. He's coming back again. We'll think up the next quarter. He'll be back sometime in early or late winter, I guess. He'll be back and joining us on the show again. But today we're talking about a book that he co-produced or published with Stephen C. Ferguson. Why did you pick Stephen to co-author with you on this book?
That's an excellent question. Stephen and I have been, um, I was his teacher actually in the early 1990s. He was a student at the University of Missouri when I was there, and he was my top student at the University of Missouri. Later, he went to the University of Kansas, where I went, and earned his doctorate in philosophy. And so we had developed a bond, a very strong bond, from the time he was an undergraduate student at Missouri to the time in which he became a graduate student at the University of Kansas. And we continued this strong bond, and his interest in the kind of work I was doing, we just blended so well together. And so I often remark that he is literally and figuratively my right hand. Those who know me personally know what I the joke and humor in that one.
How important is Malcolm X in our
Malcolm
world of
X
philosophy?
is a, yes, he's extremely important. Malcolm X, while he was not academically trained as a philosopher, he had deep philosophical insights that profoundly had an impact not only on the African American community, but on the African continent as well. Malcolm X, I think, is one of the most profound political philosophers of the 20th century. And in fact, Stephen Ferguson and I, Dr. Ferguson and I, published a very important piece on Malcolm X that appeared in an anthology on Malcolm X. And what we point out is that Malcolm's growth and development led to developing a world outlook that went beyond Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. And the break that he made from the Nation of Islam centered on the fact that Malcolm understood that the struggle was not a matter of black people versus white people. It was a matter of oppressor against oppress. And Malcolm argued then that when we understand the struggle is a struggle against those who own wealth and power and those who do not have it. And so this international fight is a part of the African American struggle. And so he attempted to raise the question, and I think a very important and philosophically profound question of namely, how do we move from civil rights to human rights? That if you restrict the struggle merely to passing legislation to enhance one's civil rights, then you can expect fundamental change. You cannot expect it because the human rights violation that come directly from the United States government are what is at stake. And so what he wanted to do was widen the conception of the political battle from a battle of civil rights to human rights. And so in that regard, Malcolm X won the respect of so many throughout the world. He went to Ghana and met with Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, who I had mentioned earlier. I had the fortune of meeting his wife, Betty Shabazz. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, when I was at Central State, I brought Dr. because she earned her PhD, Dr. Betty Shabazz to Central State University. And one thing that I was struck by is how deeply Malcolm influenced her, not only at a personal level, but in terms of her political understanding of the world. So I would say that Malcolm is the most significant non academic philosopher that we had in the period, in the late period of the 19, uh, of the 20th century.
How does Angela Davis fit in?
Well, Angela fits in very well because she's another example of how Black women who were generally marginalized in the field of philosophy were outstanding contributors to the field, nevertheless. Angela Davis uh, is known by many as an activist, but some who are more aware of her history know that she is also a philosopher. And so we wanted to include her on the cover of the book because she epitomized this idea of the unity of theory and practice, philosophy, and social change. And so Angela Davis's work has extended over a number of areas, including the oppression of Black women, the struggle for Black power, the fight for socialism and in communism. She was a member of the Communist Party for a number of years, and today continues on and as an activist, though she's now retired from her work as a professor at the University of California, where she taught for a number of years in the Department of the History of Consciousness. But she's still quite active today in her late 70s, but she hasn't missed a step. And we think that our students studying her is important. So we discussed in our book Angela Davis's very profound discussion about the relationship between slavery and bourgeois democracy. Now, notice I said bourgeois democracy because most people just use the term democracy and not understand that the very history of democratic um, republics or democratic government has, from the very beginning, been based upon enslavement. When you go back to Athens, where you have the development of a democratic government, it was based upon enslavement. When you look at the beginning of the United States, when they met to have the Constitutional Convention and establish what was called a democratic republic, it was based upon the foundation of the enslavement of African Americans. And what Angela Davis brings to the picture is an astute understanding of how those two things operate together. So one can never just merely say that the United States is a democratic country when in fact its foundation remains the oppression of African American people, of indigenous people, and generally of other people of color. So she has been at the forefront, both practically as well as in her scholarly work.
Hmm. Janice Robertson writes, she says she loves philosophy. It encourages critical thinking and analysis. And I do believe that that is so true. Um, how can one begin to develop a critical level of thinking rather than just taking what they see as being foundation of truth? How can we start thinking better and thinking more critical about what's going on in the world than just assuming certain things?
Yes, and that's a very profound question. I think we begin by understanding that all of our basic presumptions and assumptions should be under question. We have a part in the book where we talk about that in our chapter on meta philosophy. Meta philosophy is the philosophy of philosophy. Philosophy is that one discipline, unlike any other, that calls into question its very definition. So, the definition of philosophy itself is a philosophical problem. But in our chapter, we talk about Dr. Roy D. Morrison, an African American philosopher, a very profound African American philosopher, and he talks about basic postulates. Now, some may remember from high school the idea of a postulate or an axiom, and those are starting points. We presume the truth of an axiom or a postulate without question, and then move from there to make deductions about what is true and what is false. What Dr. Morrison raises is a very important point that all our basic postulates should be under question. Now, I know that's hard, especially for a lot of African Americans, because the influence, particularly of religion, leads to a culture whereby the acceptance of things on faith alone is the basis for the cultural context in which people live. But philosophy offers another approach. And so the way we begin to think critically is to challenge our basic assumptions and presumptions. Because most of our basic presumptions and assumptions are gained by way of how we've been socialized into the world. That's why we'll find that many people, in terms of their religious beliefs, hold to religious beliefs of the community that they were born in. So it's not uncommon to see then that one unquestionably embraces the assumptions of the community, the families, and the network of people who we were around from the very beginning and without question. So if we ask, why do you believe it? Most people will say, well, that's because the people around me believe that, and the people before them, the generation before, believed that. So to question those things becomes primary. A lot of people, in terms of their political understanding, it's not based upon a critical assessment of their presumptions about what is politically the key question. For example, for a long time, in terms of the social movement of the 60s, called the civil rights movement of the 60s, people focused on the issue of rights. And that's why it was characterized as a civil rights movement. But over time, it became clear that rights are not at the foundation, and that at the foundation was something called power. and that without power, rights are very meaningless. And so there emerged then the Black Power movement, which became then the foundation for understanding the character of rights. But without critically assessing what it means to talk in terms of rights, without understanding its foundation and power, would mean then thinking that gaining certain rights in and of itself is progress. But as we can see today, in the 21st century, people are being stripped of their voting rights. And we know full well that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 has been uprooted. And so the question we have to say, is it a question of rights which is under contention, or is it the exercise of power that we have to consider? And so those are some of the things philosophically, I think, are important for us to understand why we must begin with our basic assumptions and presumptions.
Thank you so much. Our hour of power is over, Dr. John. Can you believe it?
Now, I tell you, they go so fast, don't they?
Yes, indeed. Holly responds relying to Beverly Leonard. Good morning, Miss Beverly. Thank you so much for joining us, to Holly and everybody else who came to be here on the show with Dr. John McClendon III from Michigan State University, a professor in the philosophy department. We thank you so much, John. I wish we could do this every day, but unfortunately, we can't. Coming up on Thursday, did you know it's World Philosophy Day on Thursday, John?
Say that again, please.
Thursday, November 18th is World Philosophy Day.
Oh, I didn't know that. I'm glad I learned something here.
That's right, you
That's
learned
great.
something.
I will have to make sure that my students on Thursday work extra hard.
Indeed, check it out. I found that out. I checked that out. So on World Philosophy Day on Thursday, might want to pick up this book. You might want to learn something about African American philosophers and philosophy. We'll see you next quarter, Dr. John.
I look forward to it. It's always so exciting, and I always admire your hard work and what you contribute to the community. So, anytime you need me, just let me know.
Indeed,
Thank you so
indeed.
very much.
Thank you. It's all due to our God, our God. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My mission has been accomplished because somebody learned something today. I know you did. I did too. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Edna Howell-Parrish.